most books that are written in spirituality are following assiduous spiritual practice, depth of philosophical reflection, assiduous study of other people and original sources, and Involution is not the product of any of those things. So why me, and why am I here, and why did I write it? Well, I have to say I gave it a lot of thought before I rewrote it. And I would like to show you that this is book past, written as a scientific monograph 45 years ago. This is book present, and both together, time past and time present, are both together in book future, which is a DNA molecule. And therefore, what I want to clarify is why I felt the need to write this book. Most books on spirituality these days tend to either be variations of brace, brace, Armageddon tomorrow, or follow me and Nirvana will appear for you, or just buckle down and accept that we've made one hell of a mess of the world and just resign yourself to it. And therefore, the decision to write Involution was because it was none of those. What I wanted to demonstrate was what science and the story of science and the chronology of science has actually missed, which may give one pause for cheer that humanity hasn't been quite as bad as they're painted. On the other hand, a new vision of the story that has been traditionally told needs some adjustment. So I think the best way for me to convey the writing of this book is to tell you that it has been entirely shaped by my life. It is the book that wrote my life. And no matter how quickly often I try to run from it, it put a hand on my collar, dragged me back, and made me write more lines. And the reason that it did that was I have to now disclose the genesis of the book in an original experience which happened just about 45 years ago, which totally transformed my view of reality and needed the reconciliation with communal and consensus reality. And what my life has been since is simply accumulating the vocabulary to clothe what was a skeleton. The skeleton, which was this scientific monograph, was simply titled A Theory of Involution, and it was written in the hope of journal publication. I disembarked from a banana boat in Southampton docks 45 years ago with this manuscript, about £10, and a ticket to a conference in Oxford that had been handed to me on nature, man and God. And the events that preceded that disembarkation had stripped my life of everything. The experience that lay at the genesis of this book had also caused my husband to have severe concerns for my sanity and divorce me pronto. And therefore my United States visa, which was an academic wife's visa, was nullified. I had 2 small children I hoped to be able to support, and this was, I hoped, my passport to the world of academia. It is a very simple thesis, and I think I can encapsulate it quite quickly. Instead of consciousness, as is commonly thought, being the product of the last 5 minutes of evolutionary time and arising out of complex brains and complex nervous system, Involution postulates that consciousness has been embedded in every form of matter, from molecular, atomic, organ systems, obviously organisms, and the more complex the organism, the more autonomous it becomes because of the complexity of consciousness. And therefore, what I postulate, and you will see when I describe the experience why this arose, is that science has been the recovery of that encoded memory. 45 years ago, DNA was known simply to code for protein synthesis and nothing else. It was also not considered to be in any way modified by the experience of the organism that contained that DNA. The radical aspect of my thesis, which is probably why it never was accepted, is that I was suggesting that DNA was modified by the experiences of the organism, but not just in the organism containing the DNA, but because of the network of DNA and communication, the field of DNA, any maverick new departure from the norm was conveyed throughout the network. So that DNA is both an individual, an immanent phenomenon, and a transcendent one. And also, if DNA codes for consciousness, we are now looking at a co-creating God. Whether you call it Allah or Buddha or consciousness, we're discussing something which co-creates the natural world. I suppose you would like me to perhaps give you some idea of the experience that made me see this. I had returned to Miami, where my first husband had a post at the university, after spending a year with Konrad Lorenz in Germany. I was a completely uninitiated, I wouldn't say I was uninterested in spirituality, but I wasn't pursuing any kind of spiritual path, and nor had I studied in great depth those who had. After the return to Miami, we invited, my husband and I, a man and his wife to dinner to thank them for a loan of the house. And in the course of this meal, he was discussing the structure of matter, and simply threw into the conversation that matter was just Chinese boxes, one inside the other, and that actually the entirety of the scientific fraternity was simply creating languages for what they were discovering. At that point, there was no memory involved. He just imagined that it was all created. In the course of the at the end of the meal, he threw his keys to his wife and walked out of his marriage after a dinner party. And the next 3 weeks, I simply could never avoid running into him. It was never planned. Wherever I went, he'd be on a bench, he'd be at the dentist, he'd be waiting in the drugstore, and wherever I went, I ran into him every day. And this then became clear that something was in control of circumstances that we were absolutely unaware of any way to explain. The net result was that we did go away to Key West, where the land runs out to the southernmost tip, and there on a beach in the dawn, the experience happened. We were simply sitting, looking at the sun rising over the sea, and I looked at him, he was quite close, and his face fractured, as though painted on glass, and the glass shards moved to the periphery of vision, taking the landscape with it. It was as though the waxwing had been stunned, and as it fell, it pulled the painted cheesecloth down. The landscape was no more. Gone were all dimensions, with all newly dissolved walls, leaving the loom unoccupied by either thread or time, into which an all-seeing eye swelled slowly into sight, to gaze behind and forward, clear and compassionate. The only thing that was that eye, all visual else dissolved. The words conveyed from mind to mind were spoken through the air, until, confirmed identical, it slowly disappeared. From the periphery, the wings of stage, the landscape now returned. The spicules of that curtain rent moved back to reconnect, a face with stricken, swimming eyes, a freshly purling sky, Plato's surface of that peerless cave of false persuasive sense. That experience, shared with another human being, meant that we were looking at something that had a reality outside of the two of us, which could never be doubted because it had been witnessed by two. So it was a kind of showing, and the circumstances that had led up to it, his leaving his marriage and running into him, were to bring us to that point. At which point, after that, I lost everything. As I say, my visa, and I landed in successful work. I'm sure you will make some contribution. Well, I have to say I was devastated by that, but it was the best thing that probably ever happened, because what I had written was a scientific thesis for the consideration of a very narrow scientific view, merely introducing consciousness as that which science had ignored. What the rejection by the scientific community did for me was to force me to go back. And really what happened after that was I then had to seek for corroborative experiences in the mystics and everybody that I'd ever read about, and clothe the skeleton. And so today's book is a skeleton but clothed with soft tissue, organ systems, and some connective tissue. And it's pretty well clothes that in terms of showing the evidence, and what I had accumulated over this time was the evidence that showed that science was the incremental recovery of memory. And of course, by now, this was only just published, by now DNA as a storage of memory is now becoming a very plausible hypothesis. So really, I think what I was forced to assess is why the first failed so dismally. And I think the one thing that I find useful is that the sign of the cross, which is of course where we all intersect with the world, we are all part of that sign of the cross, the vertical of any author or any thinker is that which stretches between heaven and hell. The horizontal goes to the past and to the future, and the intersection and the eyepiece of that is the point at which an author can make a contribution. If they're far too far to the right, too far into the future, they will simply miss a target. If they're too far in the past, they will be passé and rather tedious. And getting it right, both in terms of language and in terms of how you do it, is critical if you seek to make any kind of contribution. And
in the presentation on the Watkins website for this evening, it said, as you were just finishing up, science is sort of catching up. Do you think science, as we understand it, you know, in the Western nations, will catch up and explain more and more to a point where there is this sort of reunification?
What, in fact, involution does is it augments the traditional divergent view of the tree of life, in which all outer things are external to our understanding, with an internal enfolding of consciousness right from the very base, which turns a divergent process into a convergent one. And the hypothesis is probably best illustrated by showing this diagram. Here we have the Big Bang, and here the incremental enfolding of consciousness in more and more complex forms of matter, until the complexity forces the convergence to man. Man then emerges on the Serengeti plain with all the forms of memory already retained within himself. And the brain the purpose of the brain is to be able to handle all this data. The brain does not emit consciousness. I believe it reads it and interprets its own DNA, and it interprets its connections with other DNA. So here we have the human infant who, by the time humanity turns up, is fully autonomous. Everything that is required he has to learn, and to learn from scratch. So here we have the human infant, which in a sense is a kind of gourd of the total. And once the bipedalism and the opposable thumb of mankind allowed him to explore the world about him, he started to penetrate his own memory through intuitive understanding of the world. Found that what he intuited from his memory matched the outer world, and the world reflected himself. So incrementally, the penetration of the unconscious became transferred to the conscious mind, or the collective conscious, and the collective conscious has to address two parts of the brain, left and right, thesis, antithesis. The great moments of synthesis created by genius dipping into the unconscious mind are those points at which the eurekas happened, and they were the brilliant scientists who led the cavalcade of this recovery. So really, that's the essence of it. So in answer to your question, science will be looking not at a divided world, but at the world that is all consciousness. The only way that you can, something I might have mentioned, is that the book ends with reason and soul. The book is taken with reason and soul, conducting you on a journey through the whole history of scientific thought. And at the end of Canto the Ninth, soul suggests that reason should withdraw because we are now moving into a realm where thesis and antithesis has no place. It is all experience. And of course, the moments of synthesis, the moments of genius insight have all been mini mystical experiences. So what I'm talking about is mystical science. And I believe now that we've reached the end point whereby science has reached this and is now running out of matter, as we know, very fast, and running out of energy. So science is going to have to reapply itself not to a world that is external to its understanding, but a world that is internal to its understanding experientially. And suddenly all the nullius in verba prohibition that science puts on anything, that they take no man's word, it all must be experimentally verified, cannot apply to internal experience. It never has, it never will. But the journey that involution traces through the scientific adventure addresses this rosary on which it is threaded, addresses these momentary insights that have led mankind from this bridge passage right to the base. Sense encapsulates what ultimately the book is trying to say, which is that there are many ways to knowledge, but that analytical, intellectual knowledge is not the way that will satisfy anybody, because it is always bound the thesis and antithesis, antipathy. You can never have it all, and therefore intellectual understanding, satisfying though it may be to the ego, does not satisfy the soul. So reason and soul have left the Aegean and are on their way to Rome, and reason is very keen to dally in Alexandria, and soul persuades her they can visit Archimedes instead, because he spent all his life in Alexandria. On the outskirts of the town, between the buttresses, all clothed in oleander and dense shade, from carob trees he will be found. They say plaintive goats bleat through his days, through his memories, sand sifters of a different sort, with things perhaps we might impart. Visitors? I receive no visits now. Bid them depart. Say I am old, or if you will, no longer sensible. Where are they bound? To Rome. Tell them to tarry in the town. Rome is on its way to burn us out. Such visits weary, what's in a name? They'll nibble raisin detail, but tear the wholesome loaf, all sweetmeats bruised by questioning. What do I recall of Apollonius? Well named for God. Will he appear at even, lissom on a rock, bronzed by the setting sun, his chest a quiver, ribs all laced with indrawn breath? A moment later, the ebbing sea enfolding him, its meniscus thick with molten gold. But they will ask, what did he leave? What conquer? What import did his calculations hold? Ellipses, parabolas, hyperbolas of talk will drown my precious vision of the boy. Tell us of Eratosthenes instead. Was he not curator in your day? Did he not put a girdle round the earth? Was it not his sieve of mind that shook out the succession of the primes, pierced the sphere on which he stood, with an axis pole to pole round which he moved? Was not the equator what he named, imagination's scalpel that incised the globe? If you know the substance of his muse, why ask? Why are you wasting time? Eratosthenes, my friend, how desolate your absence proves. Remember how I ran through all those swarming streets. My slave was burdened like a beast, so I might leap the library steps to your high eyrie in the roof. Yes, well, I might have travelled through the realms, my continents of troubled thought. Yes, yes, raised water from the river's bed, swung the earth around my head, moved the pyramids to tilt upon a fulcrum, and submerged floating bodies, displaced weight, seen planets circumscribe the sun. Yet none of this answered the still small voice that whispered, what is a man? Why has he come? To fathom out all that he is, but not know what he thirsts to find. Equivalent. Jung's idea of the collective unconscious was absolute anticipation of this. I don't know whether Laszlo's Akashic field has been ever equated to Jung's collective unconscious or not, but whether it's Boehm's implicate order or the Akashic field, or possibly even Sheldrake's morphic fields, what I have used instead is the idea of a very cogent collective unconscious, but attenuated to DNA. I may be wrong about that, but I'm increasingly confident that that is the network that will be seen to match what we have created the model of it in the World Wide Web. We have actually the network of DNA talking to each other all the time, and there has been amazing work done in Russia which would bear this out. I don't know if you know of the work of Peter Garayev, but he is using modulated laser light, which is passed through DNA, to talk to other DNA, and thereby restored the destruction of the seeds that were destroyed at the Chernobyl disaster. He has revivified them by letting their DNA be re-instructed by healthy DNA seeds, and they therefore sprout. And he has taken DNA from the roots, tuber roots of potato plants, and let it talk to the DNA of stems, and found it's produced potatoes on the stems. It never normally happens, but that is the suggestion that DNA is now a web of which science is going to increasingly become aware. The trouble with science, it is so long believed that the brain and the nervous system is the emission idea of consciousness. It's going to take quite a jump to go back. And that's another reason why I wrote it poetically, because science will be the last group of people to heed this book, because they have very fixed parameters, and the idea of their own science being generated by experience, even that will be a hard swallow for them.